Welcome to the Superhero Bibliophiles podcast. This is where we talk about superhero comic books, graphic novels, all that kind of fun stuff. And joining me today to discuss Volume 1 of Superman, the Man of Steel, which collects the John Byrne run on the Superman titles, is Logan Crowley. Logan, how you doing today?
I'm doing great, Perry. Thank you so much for having me back.
Well, always a pleasure to have you on. And I'm really looking forward to jumping into this with you. But before we jump into the comic, why don't you remind people about who you are and what you do?
Okay, so I am the co-host of a podcast called Single Bound that I host with my lovely wife, uh, who also is good at talking. Loveliness obviously doesn't really help with a podcast that much, but the we talk about single issues of comics, self-contained in one issue stories that you can pick up and go through them in one sitting and have a beginning, middle, end arc. Um, and we just picked back up, though our release schedule is kind of iffy right now because my wife is just about to have a baby in the next month or so. So, bear with us as the release schedule is iffy right now, but we would love to have you.
All right, very cool. Congratulations again. You made that announcement last time you were on the show. So
Yep.
very cool to, and by the time people listen to this, the baby might already be here. So, congratulations in advance. Um,
Oh, cool. I'll listen to it with him.
yeah, there you go. Good way to get them started young, huh? But besides that, anything that you're interested in lately, anything that's grabbing your attention these days?
Oh, okay. So I'm working on a new comic that with a new artist. It is very, very early days. We are just working on concept stuff right now. But when I was looking at his stuff, he has a definite like 90s extreme action flair. Like, so I've been thinking, what are my favorite 90s runs and trying to revisit them. So I'm in a very extreme shoulder pads sort of moment. I'm reading David's Hulk. I'm reading Thunderstrike. I'm reading Kyle Rayner, Green Lantern, Spider Girl, and the question of what comics fit the '90s aesthetic, which is one of my least favorite aesthetics in comics, but I think that they're really good, has been an interesting little sojourn for me of what's the best of the bad, you know. And I think as I started compiling my list and was getting up over 10, it's interesting. I think that I may have been too harsh on the 90s my whole life. I'm realizing as I'm going through this because I started this project of trying to figure out which runs I was going to look at. And I thought, okay, well, I'll have two or three comics from that aesthetic that I really like. And and I got close to 10, 11, Uh, and so it's been interesting. It's made me reevaluate some of that and check my own biases at the door a little bit.
Yeah, I came in with the 90s, so like that's always got a soft spot for me. We had recently covered the X-Men Fatal Attractions cover crossover, and it was a lot of fun going back and revisiting that with Scott Honig. But yeah,
Oh,
there's
that's
there's
classic.
yeah, there were the 90s were definitely not let's say not the strongest era, but there's still some gems in there that you can find. Uh Fairly recently, not fairly recently, but I think Aztec by Morrison was definitely one of those highlights there. Morrison's
Mm-hmm.
JLA stuff. A lot of stuff coming out of DC in the 90s was really solid stuff.
Well, DC kind of pivoted, right? Like Marvel leaned so hard into the art, and they had the artists that had the aesthetic and could do it well locked up. Whereas DC was, I mean, I don't remember who drew Justice League Task Force, but we don't remember who drew Justice League Task Force in this moment on this comic book podcast with two well-read nerds. So, like,
Hmm.
that kind of says the whole thing. So, DC was forced to pivot as like, all right, well, if we can't get the best artists, I guess we'll have to settle for all the best writers, and it really made a difference. Some of those comics, the art is really lacking, but like I people talk about like Mullet Superman. Mullet Superman's a great run if you actually read it. People
Hmm.
scoff about it, but there's a lot of good stories in there.
Yeah, I
The
think that's
issue where
more
he
just
fights
the idea of the design look as opposed to the actual stories themselves.
Oh yeah. Well, even in some of the comics that I listed where I'm like, I like this run, there's stuff like, why is the Hulk wearing a romper? Like
Mhm.
there's a lot of design stuff that just
There
doesn't
were
work.
some, yeah, there were some very questionable design choices made in the 90s.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's cool. That's really cool. Yeah, I'm glad. So what kind of 90s stuff has really been grabbing your attention then of the stuff that you've been looking at?
Well, Peter David's Hulk, Tom DeFalco. Tom DeFalco really is one of, I think, the top three most underrated writers of that era, maybe in comics, because Thunderstrike and Spider Girl are two of the ones that I've gravitated towards. And Thunderstrike, again, is a character of questionable designs, whereas Spider Girl looks better in that costume than I think Ben Riley ever did. That design just fits a feminine figure so much better,
Hmm.
and that character has so much meat on the bone. Uh, One of the best spinoff series of all time, probably in my opinion, the best Elseworld uh, for my money. Like if I only had to pick one to keep, 100 issues of an Elseworld is incomparable.
Yeah, and that was an interesting book because it kept getting canceled and then the fans kept managing to bring it back. So it was really, which is really unusual. Like even when there are it's very rare for the fan enthusiasm to be so high that they can get the title to come right back from cancellation almost immediately after it's been canceled.
Well, yeah. Well, I think it helped. I think people kind of forget now that Spider Girl was sort of in that Ultimate Spider-Man spot just before it was. There's been a whole industry done by Marvel of benefiting off of how poor Spider-Man has been for 30 years, right? Like the main Spider-Man book, they have made so much money off of another book because they could not get Amazing Spider-Man to go on a consistent trek for any length of time.
Mhm.
But definitely, if you're talking late '90s and into the early 2000s, uh, that was one of the best comics on the shelf. All of MC2, really. If so few people now have read it, if you're listening to this and you haven't read any MC2, or even if you have no idea what I'm talking about when I say MC2, look it up. It's all pretty great. Uh, really good stuff.
Yeah, I missed the boat on the MC2 stuff when it came out. I mean, I was reading at the time, but it just didn't catch my interest. It's something I've been curious about having a look at, but one of the big problems is that so much of that stuff is not in print. Even like the Spider-Girl stuff, they've only got a few of the volumes of her stuff in print anymore. I
Oh
know
wow.
they've got a modern era epic collection that they've started with her, so hopefully those will continue until they collect the whole series. For
Well,
my part, though, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say the last thing to put a button on that is if I can express how big a Spider Girl fan I am to anybody who hasn't read it. Like, I think I said last time I was on the show, I'm having a boy, we're naming him Clark. If we had had a girl, her name was going to be May.
Oh,
So, and
nice.
for Spider Girl. So,
So for my part, I've been catching up on Donny Cates' Thor run. I'd read the first book a few years back when it first came out, but I hadn't dipped into the rest of it. And so I've started picking up on that, and I've just finished I think it was the third trade I just finished. Um, yeah, I just finished the third trade, and yeah, I'm really digging it. It's a lot of fun, and Cates is one of these writers who he made a big splash when he came out, but then he had an accident, and then he had to back away from comics as a result of it, and it's really kind of and I'm hoping he's going to be able to come back in because his stuff is really entertaining.
I'm not a huge Donny Cates fan.
Oh, really?
That Thor run specifically. I'm a huge Thor fan. Like I think I've read the majority of every Thor run there's been, other than some of that stuff with the Iron Bra in the '90s. I just can't bring myself to embrace the crossing era stuff. Uh, but Jack Kirby I'm also a Don Blake guy, which I think is rare among Thor fans, as Donny Cates demonstrates in that run. I don't want to
Yeah.
spoil it too much for people who haven't read it, but where the Don Blake plot goes really kind of hurt my feelings, I think. And Donny Cates also he writes he has a tendency to write for that kind of power scalar Dragon Ball Z audience.
Hmm.
And it's not that I love a superhero fight. I love when they let the characters go at it. But there's a lot of Donny Cates stories, particularly King in Black, though there were also some moments with the Herald of Galactus Thor stuff where it really felt like he was writing to specific, it was to create this new power level of something less than what the story was. The story's plot didn't seem as important to him as look at this shiny new Thor.
Yeah, see, I was never a Don Blake guy, so because my biggest time reading Thor was the Jurgens run in the late 90s, early 2000s, and that didn't involve Blake at all. So when I read what Cates had done with him, and I got to that whole conception of Don Blake and the kind of twist he had on, I thought it was really intriguing, and especially like the horror type aspect when Thor goes into that dimension. I thought was really interesting, and I thought it was so it totally worked on me. But if you're not a fan, if you're an old school fan of Thor, I could definitely see why you would not like that though.
Well, it's interesting. I started, I think I said this before, I started with the Essentials. That was my first like Marvel exposure. So that was the earliest Thor stuff that I read. But even then, I wasn't a huge Don Blake fan until a couple years ago. I have a muscular disorder. Uh, uh, they eventually diagnosed it as idiopathic spasmodic disorder. Idiopathic is how people with a college degree shrug. Like it's a word that means we don't know. But they did eventually figure out some medication that would work for me. But for like 4 years, I walked with a cane. Um, or for 4 years, I mostly didn't walk. When I did walk, I walked with a walker or a cane, so I couldn't control my leg function. And during that period, I just really glommed on to the idea of Don Blake and that Thor was in this crippled man, who was so trapped in most of his life, but could then release and become the Marvel Superman of the era. Uh, and I thought there was something interesting with if you read the Kirby stuff, there's a really interesting resolution to Don Blake eventually, where the question comes up of is Thor really Don Blake in the guise of Thor, or is it Thor pretending to be Don Blake? And the answer is basically yes. Like he was Thor, he is also Don Blake. He is both of these things at once. And they, later they would kind of use that as a lever to unzip Don. But I think one of the problems that a lot of people have with Thor is he's not very humanized. He's not. Everything is very grandiose and very big, and I think that Dawn gave a line to the public to him that Thor doesn't always have. And I think you can see how well that works in the Jane Foster stuff because Jane Foster's cancer really felt like a throwback to that Thor paradigm. Uh, but I will say this because I don't want to just be mean about the comic, and I hate Donny Cates having that accident. But to sing the praise of that run for a second, the art in that run is incredible, and that is
Yeah.
one of the best designed Thor costumes of all time. Just
Oh yeah. Yeah.
however much I didn't like the comic, I bought the action figure. So
Well, today we are talking about going taking it you called it Marvel Superman, so now we are going back to that because we are talking about DC Superman and the first volume of John Byrne's Superman Man of Steel. And this collects here the Man of Steel miniseries numbers 1 to 6, Superman numbers 1 to 4, Adventures of Superman 424 to 428, and Action Comics 584 to 587. And even though this is, it's mostly billed as the John Byrne stuff, the Adventures of Superman stuff is of course done by Marv Wolfman and Jerry Ordway. Um, but let's so this was the big Superman reboot after Crisis on Infinite Earths. DC had tapped John Byrne to reboot Superman for the 1980s. And let's start off with that about that reboot idea. What obviously you weren't reading at the time because you're younger than me, and I wasn't reading at the time either. But what's your thoughts on John Byrne's reboot overall, Or like when was the first time let's take it back. When did the first time you came to know about Byrne's reboot?
Well, in a lot of ways, this is my first Superman. I had a very peculiar first exposure to Superman, I guess, because there are people who their first exposure was Byrne and they love it, and they don't like Superboy and they don't like Silver Age stuff. Um, and then there are people who are the opposite, the Mark Wades, the Grant Morrisons of the world. I I was in a weird place because my earliest memory of Superman is there. And those three things are the Triangle era Superman. That is the John Byrne Superman. Other writers are doing it, but that is the manual that they are using to build the machine. Uh, Superman the animated series, which is the John Byrne Superman with a Silver Age aesthetic kind of painted over the top of it, and then the Super Friends, which is the Silver Age Superman and has Superboy episodes and all that stuff. So I'm in a weird place where that's something that divides people a lot. But to me, John Byrne Superman and Superboy and moving planets and not being able to lift a tank, it was all just stirred in together. The inconsistencies were the consistency, right? So John Byrne Superman to me is Superman. And I think that not enough people these days realize that John Byrne Superman is Superman to them, even if they haven't read this. If your first Superman was Lois and Clark, John Byrne is your Superman. If your first Superman was the animated series, John Byrne is your Superman. If your first Superman was Smallville, John Byrne is your Superman. If right now you just got into Superman this year and you're watching My Adventures with Superman, to a large part, John Byrne is your Superman. Like the idea of Clark as this farm boy whose parents are alive, uh, who is very, very tied to his earthly values, who is concerned about being an outsider if he's found out, who takes to the costume later in life. That's John Byrne brought that to the comics. And some of it's in the movie, but the particular pattern of it, right? This very buff, very muscular. I mean, Superman was never Schwarzenegger jacked before this. And if somebody draws Superman now, like as a spoof, he's always a blown up, meathead. John Byrne, like I so I think that this is probably the most influential Superman comic since the first one.
No, I think there's a lot of truth to that. And for my part, I also had kind of a mix of Superman growing up. Like my first encounter with Superman was the Donner film, the 1978 one.
Mhm.
So Christopher Reeve was my first introduction to Superman, but then we had of course, you had Lois and Clark. We had Superman the Animated Series on the air, which, like you said, they were the John Byrne Superman. But then when I started getting into Superman comics, I came in I mean, I had read like Death of Superman and stuff like that. But I didn't start regularly reading Superman until the Loeb Kelly era. And
Mhm.
that was when I came into Superman. And while it's technically a continuation of the Triangle era, that was also when they were definitely shifting towards a more, let's say, cohesive view of Superman, where it wasn't so much the John Byrne one, but they're taking aspects of the post-crisis one, mixing aspects of the pre-crisis one. So it was a little bit more mixed as opposed to what Byrne was doing, which was very different from the pre-crisis stuff. And it wasn't until I was in high school, and that's when I read the Man of Steel miniseries, and uh, my teacher, he was a comic book fan, and so Bernie from Digging for Kryptonite. He was my teacher in high school, and he loaned me his 6 issues of Man of Steel when I was in high school, and that was my first time
Wow.
reading it. And at the time, I dug it. I dug it a lot, but um, as I've grown older, my opinions on Byrne Superman and what my ideal version of Superman has shifted. I'm not all post-crisis or pre-crisis. My ideal Superman is like a hodgepodge of different things. So there are aspects of the Byrne reboot that I do really like. The idea of the Kents being alive is something I've come around to. Um,
Agreed.
the idea of him being more tied to his human identity, and the whole idea, like, you know Clark is who I am, Superman is what I can do type thing. Yeah, I'm down with that. Lex Luthor as a businessman, totally down with that too. I'm also not a fan of Superboy. I don't care if it screws with the Legion continuity. I don't care about the Legion. I feel that the idea of Clark going on a journey and then becoming Superman, is there's something very mythic to that I think the Superboy aspect kind of undercuts a little bit. So I'm not a fan of the Superboy stuff. Um, that being said, there's also a lot of stuff in here that I don't really like. And we'll talk a little bit more as we get into some of the characters, but focusing just on Superman here, I don't like Man of Action Clark Kent, right? I don't like the kind
Mm-hmm.
of George Reeves inspired Clark Kent. I feel that, and I'm not going to say that Christopher Reeves Clark Kent was spectacular either. I've got a lot of criticisms of his Clark Kent too, because I feel that the whole purpose of what I call the Metropolis Clark identity is it's supposed to be a disguise. He's supposed to turn people. Clark Kent is supposed to be that guy you don't never pay attention to. You don't notice. So you don't even remember what he looks like. So the idea of Christopher Reeve bumbling around all over the place and bumping into things, he's almost like a cartoon character. You are going to remember that guy. You're not
Yeah.
going to remember him in a good way, but you're going to remember him. But the John Byrne Clark Kent is the opposite. It's like the Dean Cain thing. Like, I always, when I go back and when I watched Lois and Clark at the time, I thought Dean Cain was great. But when I watch it now, his Clark feels very arrogant, and I don't like it. And I don't
Yeah.
like that kind of like. And I think the animated series actually, and I'll push back where you said that the animated series is the John Byrne Superman. Yes, but I put an asterisk on it when it comes to Clark Kent, because I feel like his Clark Kent had a more subtle, quiet confidence about him. He wasn't as Man of Action. He had his moments there, but he also had this kind of quiet confidence where he would kind of fade in the background. So I thought they did a really good job of finding a balance between the more wallflowers Clark Kent and the more Man of Action one, where he has these moments, but for the most part, he can verbally spar with Lois and all that. But he's also, a little bit more subdued than Burns Clark Kent is. Um, Also, I'm not a fan of the depowering, or also all the pseudo scientific explanations Byrne tried to come up with for his powers. I felt like this is just overdoing it. And the Krypton stuff too. I really don't like Byrne's depiction of Krypton. The aesthetic is cool, but the overall vibe of it being like this cold and emotionless place, um, or Superman's very kind of dismissive attitude towards Krypton throughout most of the pages here, that I don't like. And I feel like those. I also don't like the idea of Clark being a football star in high school. I feel like that's something that, I mean, to Byrne's credit, I didn't realize this. Memory hold this, but he does have Clark say, once he finds out that he's from, that he has this, he doesn't realize he's an alien, but when he finds out he's got this strange origin, and he realizes he's not completely human, that he does decide, oh, obviously I can't play football anymore. So that was good. But at the same time, I feel like this is an instance where Jonathan and Martha should have probably pulled him aside and said, you know what? You probably shouldn't have been doing this in the first place.
Yeah. Well, I don't think. Oh, okay. So let me. I think a great place to start. You went through your pros and cons. Let me go through mine. I'll think. I 100% agree. I love the Kents being alive now. To me, is a necessity. And tied in with that, having read a bunch of Bronze and Silver Age Superman, tying in the rural Superboy status quo into Superman status quo, to me is now necessary. If you go back to Bronze and Silver Age comics, the Kents are dead. He hardly ever goes back to Smallville. He hardly ever talks about being a farm boy. He's always dressed like Dick Van Dyke, and kind of, that's just not an important part of the character outside of the Superboy comic. And whereas if you read those old Otto Bender comics, he'll occasionally drop a y'all. He'll occasionally, and stuff like that. And he has that small town upbringing. Byrne weaving that into the status quo in a way that Superman comics prior to it didn't do, I that's a must to me. Love this design of the costume with the calf link cape, the wider emblem. The colors on this are my ideal Superman colors. Um, love this Lex Luthor with an asterisk. Trying to think what else. Do not care much for this Lois Lane. I don't. I understand what Byrne was doing, making her a redhead, because she was originally a redhead in Action Comics, and more importantly, one of the two Lois Lane actresses on the George Reeves show was redheaded. And as doesn't get talked about enough, this comic owes a huge debt to John Byrne's fandom of the George Reeves show. And the Clark Kent that's in this is John Byrne, in his mind, resetting the Superman status quo to George Reeves, the one that he grew up with. Jock Clark, I think that a lot of comic book fans are nerds. I'm a nerd myself. I tried to play football for 3 days after my growth spurt. I broke my leg and I never played football again. So I'm with you guys. But I think that our own prejudices against the athletes we knew as children bleeds into some of our comic book criticisms at times. I don't think that him being a football player is that big a deal, because what is most important there is not the Letterman's jacket. It's the lesson that Clark learns and how that plays into his life down the road. That he cannot use these abilities for personal gain because it's unfair. I do think that the same idea is told better by Jeff Johns in Secret Origin, where he's playing football with the other kids and breaks Pete Ross's arm. I think that does the same beat without changing his background that much and teaching him the same lesson. But Johns did have Byrne to springboard off of.
Well, also, I just want to
Thing,
jump in there to that point, and I thought Smallville also did a really good job of doing that lesson too.
Yes, yeah, I agree. I think the Smallville version, I mean, it is basically this, but the timeline's a little different. The timeline in Smallville is even actually worse because Clark in this doesn't realize he has superpowers. And the Kents aren't sure. You know, you have that one moment as a kid, but then there's a lot of other moments. I think there's one moment with the Thresher and one moment with the where he picks up the back of the truck. But other moments in the miniseries, and especially as you go further into the comic, there are other flashbacks to him as a kid where he gets cold, or he seems to get sick, or he just has these very human failings, and you'd go, okay, well, maybe that was a weird blip, but but he's not Superman. And that is my favorite thing about the Byrne thing. Even though I like a Superboy, I think it is paramount that Superman spent some time like a human. I don't care if it messes with Zod's powers. We'll get to that down the road. But I think that when you have moments where Superman, it happens in media all the time, Superman goes, I've never bled before, or I've never been sick before, or I like Doomsday Clock, but in the first issue when he goes, I've never had a nightmare. First of all, objectively untrue, but all of these things are just an iron wall between Superman and relating to the audience, because he stops being a person and he starts being this guy that we hate because he's never had a splinter and he's never had a a cowlick or anything. Like, let him be a human kid for a while and then come into this at puberty. It works great. And then it leads to that same arc with John, which was a fantastic part of the Rebirth run. It's just a better status quo for Superman.
Yeah.
And the last thing I'll say, and then I'll move on from this. And this is my most controversial take in this. I used to agree with you about Krypton 100%. When I read this in elementary school the first time, I've probably read this book annually, the miniseries at least, annually for my whole life at some point. Not like on purpose. I'm just talking about like where it would average out to. I used to hate this Krypton. as I have gotten older and have read through all the different eras of Superman and seen how all the different Kryptons are portrayed, and especially listen to the radio show. If you've never listened to the first episode of the radio show, there's some bad moments, but there's some good moments. But the Krypton stuff is fascinating. I think a shitty Krypton is better for the Superman status quo as a whole. Not only does it bring in characters like the Eradicator, or like on the animated series where they tie Brainiac into that. Not my favorite use of Brainiac. I'd rather use the Eradicator for all those moments. But just those stories, they create such interesting contrasts for Clark to have to deal with. They also bring in a parable that we really need to hear as a society all the time, that just does not hit the same if it is a Flash Gordon halcyon paradise with one problem that really doesn't make sense. Everybody in Silver Age Krypton is wearing a rocket on their chest and doesn't believe in rockets. Like, you know what I'm saying? I think that I think that contrast creates such interesting lessons for us, but also further establishes why Superman is the way he is, which is that if he had been born with his exact same genetics, everything natural about him on that planet, he would not be the hero he is. He would be an antiseptic weirdo with no eyebrows and mushroom sleeves. And if he'd been born in Kansas, exactly as he is, he'd be a great dude. He'd get cancer at 51 from the mills, and you'd never have heard of him, right? But when you put those two things together, when those cultures blend, that is when you get this 1 in a million guy that is the only way that it was going to work out well. And I think that is really what this Krypton brings. And I really, as I get older, I think I'm becoming a pro shitty Krypton guy.
So I want to respond to some of that because I think there's some good points you made in there, but I also have some counter arguments. But first, we're going to take a quick break, and then we'll come back and we'll dive into that. We all love superhero movies and TV shows, but what about the comics that inspired them? Marvel, DC, Image, and more have provided the template for the movies and shows we all enjoy watching, and it's important to honor that tradition by buying and reading comic books. Superhero Cinephiles is proud to be an affiliate of mycomicshop.com. It began as a small mail-order business operated by junior high school student Buddy Saunders all the way back in 1960, and has been operating on the internet since 1997. My Comic Shop has new releases, value packs, back issues, trade paperbacks, comic art, regular auctions, and a whole lot more, including 35% discounts on pre-orders. You can also sell your own comics or utilize their consignment services. You can even create your own want list of comics you're searching for. To get started, check out our affiliate link in the show notes or on the superherocinephiles.com homepage. And we're back. So you were making your arguments in favor of the shitty Krypton, and I will agree that Krypton should not be a utopia. I think you do need to have those flaws there, but I also feel like Byrne goes too far in the opposite direction, and it becomes, as Byrne himself described it, I believe, a place that deserved to blow up, and I think that is taking it too far in the opposite direction. So, I think, like we've seen in some of the later depictions of Krypton after Byrne left, or also in some other more modern forms of media, where you see Krypton is, it's a place of a lot of science and technology that can do amazing stuff, but it's also got a lot of flaws in a lot of different ways. And the hubris of the Kryptonians to thinking they're, that they can handle anything, that's a big part of it. So I feel like in Byrne's attempt to distance Superman from Krypton and being like so having so much affinity for it, he went too far in the opposite direction. I mean, so much so that and I think then this goes something else too, like the birthing matrix thing. I hate that. I
Yes.
despise the birthing matrix.
I do
The,
too. Let me say, I'm not sticking up. That's the worst part of this whole thing. Do you know how that came to be? Have you ever heard that story?
all I know is what I've heard is that Byrne wanted Clark to be a natural born U.S. citizen, is what I've heard.
I think that part is overblown. Marv Wolfman says that.
Okay.
And I'm not saying he's
Oh,
wrong
wait,
because it
wait.
was.
The idea that Lara came to Earth and then gave birth to him before dying, is that what you're talking about?
Yes, that
Yes,
was
yeah.
John Byrne's original pitch, and DC felt like that was too gruesome. And I actually think that's a brilliant idea because it solves always that problem of don't worry, honey, I've made a rocket just for the kid. Like if it's a one seater and he sends his wife, but then she doesn't survive. That's how they learn about Krypton. I think it's a brilliant idea. For whatever reason, DC didn't want to do it. John Byrne claims on his blog that he wrote The Matrix as an idea so dumb that DC would reject it and he'd get to do what he wanted to do in the first place. And DC went, nah, sperm egg, that's fine. We'll just, you can have your jizz rocket.
Uh, well, whatever the reason for it, whoever came up with it, I hate it. I think
I do too. Yeah.
such a key aspect of I think Superman's character is the fact that he's a refugee. He's an undocumented immigrant, and I think that is so important to his character. And you lose something when you make him a natural born U.S. citizen with that. Um, and also, and Byrne also had this attitude. I don't know where the actual quote is, but it was apparently on his forum, and it has been reposted a lot of times. I can't read the original because his forum is members only now, probably to avoid people publicizing the shit he says on there. But one of the things he said is that he felt that adopted kids who still have some connection to their birth parents are, I think it was like entitled little shits or something like that, or ungrateful little shits. And I'm just like, my God. I mean, you can have an interest in your biological family. You can have an interest in your family's home country and where your family came from, but you without you know making that all about your personality. It doesn't mean you're ungrateful to your adopted parents. It doesn't mean you're ungrateful to the place where you live now. It just
Yeah.
means you have this multicultural background, and I think diminishing that and this whole idea that he says here of you know um Krypton bred me, but it was Earth that gave me all I am, all that matters. It was Krypton that made oh, so no, sorry. I may have been conceived out there in the endless depths of space, but I was born when the rocket opened on Earth in America, right? This idea that, and again, this is the whole Reagan era type of thing. And that's another aspect
Yeah.
like that is very coded throughout Burns issues, particularly in this, is the Reagan
Yeah.
coding in this, which I really do not like.
Yeah. Well, I dislike what it's for more than I never noticed that or had any awareness of it until Burns quotes about it surfaced. And when that happened, obviously my feelings on it changed a little bit. But I don't but at the same time, I grew up in a very rural place. The idea that Superman is I don't want him to be a Reagan guy, obviously, but the idea that Superman culturally is a little more conservative, I think that tracks with where he's at and how he was raised. I don't love the idea of like I'm just going to put Krypton aside completely, but also by the end of Byrne's run, he Superman reverses on that idea. Well, actually, that's not by the end of Byrne's run. That comes in with Exile. So I guess other writers are the ones that reversed it, not
Yeah, I
Byrne.
felt there was a lot of and I haven't jumped into the early Triangle era, but my understanding is that pretty much as soon as Byrne left, people started rolling back some stuff that he had kind of firm
Yes.
positions on.
Well, but let me say though, for context, um, I don't know how many listeners have read what the Superman issues were like before Byrne took over. But when he's talking about uh, being an ungrateful shit, the the Bronze Age Superman had a very bizarre relationship to his culture, particularly after really through all of it, where Clark Kent on his day off is not taking Lois on a date. is not spending time with Ma and Pa because they're dead. He's sitting in his ice castle like Elsa with a hologram machine on his head, pretending he lives on Krypton.
Mhm.
There's even I have a Carrie Bates Superboy issue in there I read not long ago where from the early 80s where Superboy is only referring to the Kents as foster mother and foster
Mhm.
father
I remember you
like
mentioning that before.
like nouns. Yeah. So this status quo is not ideal, but I think that part of why it chafes us so bad now is that we still remember this, but we have completely forgotten the books that it was a reference to. Because honestly, as one of the biggest Superman fans, they're pretty bad.
Mhm.
Like outside of the Elliot S. Maggin writes some of the best Superman stories ever in there. Carrie Bates also deserves a shout out. Marv Wolfman stuff is incredible, but in between the peaks, there are some dire valleys. Um,
No, and that's a fair argument. Yeah, that
yeah,
but so yes, that stuff did need to be corrected. I'm not going to argue
yeah,
that I'm
but
definitely
this
not
is
going
an
to argue that the Bronze
overcorrection.
Age
Yeah,
exactly. It's an
yeah.
overcorrection is how I feel about it. And with that, because I don't want to spend too much time on only Clark and Superman and only this first miniseries, but I also want to talk a little bit about Lois in here. Oh my god. It's like this is
Yeah.
whenever people tell me that they hate Lois Lane, I feel like they're probably their only idea of Lois Lane comes from this miniseries because I can totally understand that.
Uh well, yeah. Yeah, she's just you still see this with female characters now, particularly female characters written by men who are very concerned about being criticized for how they write female characters tend to pull out this commando in a dress character type. I think you see it a lot of times with the modern Carol Danvers in the stories that don't do her as well. I think you see it in a lot of movies. Basically, every character Michelle Rodriguez has played.
Mm-hmm.
Like you have this where like, oh, I don't want anyone to think that this is a damsel in distress, so I'm gonna make her act like how a man acts. But the man that they picked is such an asshole, you
Yeah.
know, like, and that's my real problem with this Lois is prior to when Ordway comes in and Jurgens come in and Roger Stern come in, she is so harsh. And I think that if Lois isn't a little bit of that B word, it's not really Lois Lane, right? The Action Comics #1, she's a firecracker. You want
Mm-hmm.
her to be kind of mean, but it has to be a charming mean. It has to
Exactly.
be a snappy, witty. I think the new movie actually is
Oh, perfect. Yes,
that should be the
exactly.
template, the Lois Lane template
Mm-hmm.
specifically. Like
Oh yeah,
that
absolutely. Yes.
actress nailed it. Um, Dana Delaney, obviously from the animated series, pretty much perfect in performance. Some of the writing on that Lois, I'm not in love with,
Yeah, I agree.
but that kind of personality, and Burns just doesn't have that. She's very unlikable.
Not only that,
Um,
but she's also so petty, right? I mean, because
yeah,
this series covers his first 5 years as Superman, and then when we get into the main Superman series, she is still angry at Clark about this scoop, which also
yeah,
I don't like. I don't like the idea of Clark writing his own stories as
yeah,
Superman. I think that is complete journalistic malpractice. And
yeah.
I'm glad I didn't like that they included it at all in the movie, but I am glad that he did learn that lesson about it at the very least. But yeah, that was one of my sticking points about the new movie. And the
Although I will say that that part is not John Byrne's fault. The radio show did that in 40 is where
okay,
that first comes from. He runs into the office and goes, Mister, if I give you the biggest scoop in town, what will you say to giving me a job? Well, I've never heard of you, Sonny, but if you can come up with a story that's the biggest scoop in town, then I guess I'd have to give you a job. Be right back, Chief. You know, like that. It's right. It's in there from the jump. And it's even worse in that because that's the first version of the radio show Superman doesn't grow up in Kansas. He shows up as a full grown alien.
I remember
And
hearing about that.
yeah, so it's
And doesn't
bizarre.
some kid gives him says you should call yourself Clark Kent or something?
Yes, a kid named Jimmy, but not that one. Uh, but so that then carries over to the George Reeves show. Has pretty much a recreation uh, of that origin, and then of course somewhere little John Byrne is sitting having a nice hot glass of maple syrup in Canada, and sees that episode and goes, "That's Superman, uh, uh, a charlatan."
Yeah. Um, but yeah, but just her pettiness still, like 5 years later, she's still bitching about that
Mhm.
story. And it's like, come on, lady, let it go already. He got the story. It's not like it was any sort of like, it wasn't any sort of malice on his part. Why you and that's the thing, it just makes her, it's so unreasonable. And
Yeah.
it's one thing if Clark had already been working at the planet and then knew that Lois was trying to get the story and then undercut her, then I can understand her being so pissed off about it for so long. But the fact that that's not what happened here, it just makes her come off very poorly. Um, and
But there is a reason for it. This was a plot. This is an intentionally unlikable Lois because John Byrne was also a big Superboy fan. There's an interesting people have been sharpening knives for John Byrne about getting rid of Superboy for years. Editorial didn't want
oh yeah, that
Superboy.
was not his idea. Yes, that's
Right.
true.
Because he was a big Superboy fan, though, that's where you get the farm stuff. But most importantly, John Byrne was and is a diehard Lana Lang stan.
Well,
John
also in
Byrne,
this also in the introduction to this book, though, he says that Lori Lamaris was actually his favorite.
really,
Yeah.
that's interesting. On his blog, he talked about Lana, but I mean, but that makes that makes sense to me though because he recreates the Lori Lamaris Silver Age comic almost verbatim
Mhm.
when he does the Lori Lamaris story in this. So he wanted Lois Lane to be a supporting character, but he did not view Lois Lane as the end game for Superman and didn't want other people to. Uh, and that is for listing cons. That is a big con in this comic.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, it's also a big contrast when you see what Wolfman and Ordway were doing with Cat Grant in the Adventures
Mm-hmm.
comics, because Cat also is, she's a strong personality, but she's a much more relatable, much more likable character in this. Like I'm rooting for Cat actually throughout this entire volume.
Yeah, she has a fascinating. By the time you get through all the Adventures of Superman stuff, Cat Grant has a story arc that I don't think many people would say it was well written, but it feels so real. Of like her and Clark meet at this moment where she's trying to get her life together, and so because of that, it feels like they have a real potential for a minute. But the longer it goes on, the more her demons kind of unravel that. Her past comes back. She doesn't have that much stick to itiveness. She's a cheat. She's an alcoholic, and so she goes off the rails eventually and starts sleeping around with other men, and the relationship just doesn't happen. And also Clark is not there for her, right? Because he's busy being Superman. And
Mhm.
is that an arc that Joseph Campbell would have loved? Maybe not. Is that the story of 100,000 real dating relationships that didn't pan out? There's something very, very true to life about the way that this Cat Grant's arc goes, and I think it's kind of I think it's a very simple, but but deeply emotional tragedy by the time
It's
it
also a marked contrast, and it makes me wonder what they were thinking when they did Lois and Clark. And Tracy Scoggins is she's very entertaining, but she's also completely over the top in that. Or
yeah.
even when I went back and I read the John Superman stuff for when I did that episode of Digging for Kryptonite, like Cat is she almost makes Tracy Scoggins look normal in comparison to
Yeah.
her in the Brainiac story. Um,
We need to get
so,
this woman to
but
the hospital. Her chest
I
is full of silicone.
and then but it's funny when you go back to the original stories with Kat, you realize what a much more well-developed character she really is.
Yeah.
um but I also want to talk about Luther in this because again, I love the idea of Luther being a businessman. I think that's a really cool concept, and that credit where it's due, that was Wolfman's idea actually. Much earlier on he was asked, him and Carrie Bates were asked to redefine Brainiac and Lex Luthor, and they ended up not going with Wolfman's idea for Luthor at that time. But then when he got brought on to take part in the reboot, he brought back that idea again. And I think it's such a great way of looking at the character. The only problem is I think this is also shows the difference. I think in the Wolfman issues, we get to see a little bit more of Luthor's intelligence come through. But in the Byrne issues, he's just like a completely unlikable creep and does not come off as like a brilliant man or anything like that. And I feel like he's just, I mean, the obvious Donald Trump comparisons are there, and I think it's
Yeah.
too much, because I think that the the thing about Luthor is that I think this is what the animated series did very well, is they made him charismatic, right? This is a guy who's not, attracting women and stuff just because he's rich, or is not considered the greatest citizen in Metropolis just because he's rich, but also because he's a very charismatic guy.
Yeah.
And, Clancy Brown just oozed that. Even John Shea, I thought, was a better version of that too in Lois and
Yeah.
Clark. Um, or, obviously Michael Rosenbaum in Smallville, right? Completely
Yeah.
charismatic, and you could see, and that's why my ideal version of Luthor is the one from the Loeb Kelly run, because that was the one who was he was this billionaire, but he was also a genius, a scientific genius. He was also someone who was very charismatic, and I think you need that in Luthor. And I feel like Byrne's version just feels very one note as a result.
Well, you said at the beginning, like your ideal Superman isn't any one era of Superman. It's a hodgepodge, and I really feel that way about Superman and Lex. I don't know. There's things about this Luthor that are my favorite. I actually think this level of cruelty. Let me say this different. The capacity for this level of cruelty is very important for Lex Luthor, and I think the new movie really nailed that, right, with like shooting Molly and stuff like that. They chose let them die. Like, I think that is so important for getting across to the audience what a threat Lex Luthor is. And I think that this version does that so well. But I, you know, you kind of hit the nail on the head with, like, he doesn't really have the charisma. He doesn't really have the gravitas that I want a Lex Luthor to have. I do get frustrated when people say that he's not a super genius, though. I think that that's something that comes from the fact that when these comics were on the shelf, you couldn't necessarily read all of them. You maybe could if you were in a shop. So if you missed the Metal Man issue and the Byrne stuff, or the issue in the trade with the Power Armors and the clone Bizarro, where he's very clearly matching wits with the Japanese scientist, then yeah, you might not realize that he was a genius because he has these teams of scientists that he's working for. But as you go through this, his scientific mind is there. He just has cronies, and his cronies are scientists. But he builds the Kryptonite Metal Man by himself. Like, that basically falls into his lap in the Action Comics team up issues, and he goes, I can do something with this, and takes the responsometer and does it, in an afternoon. That's Reed Richards super science, but you don't get it all the time like you did with Silver Age Lex. Uh, and I think that's been repeated so many times, and that it isn't all the way at the forefront. Uh, that I think that people forget that it's in there at all.
Yeah, like I said, I felt like in the Wolfman issues, Wolfman did a much better job of getting it across, and I think he had softened it. But I think in the Byrne issues, he's very intent on making Lex the bad guy, and so clearly the bad guy, that I think it again, like a lot of stuff with Byrne, there's an overcorrection. There's a lot of taking things to extremes when they don't need to be.
Oh yeah, he's not a subtle writer, by any
Yeah.
stretch of the imagination.
Um, Now, is there anything else you wanted to mention about this series? Because we're getting close to the end of our time here.
Uh, I just want to specifically shout out, and I've sung its praises on other podcasts, but I'll continue to. I did an episode of it on my podcast. Issue 5 of this, I like this miniseries a lot, but the part of it that I love is issue 5, the Bizarro issue. That, to me, is one of my favorite Superman issues ever. It is a perfect recreation of its Silver Age source material, like with the parts that don't work anymore trimmed away. But most importantly to me, that comic is the most quintessential single issue of Superman. If someone asks you, what is Superman like? In that comic, you will have Superman flying around fighting crime while Lex Luthor is coming up with a plan for how to kill him. The plan creates a sci-fi creature. The sci-fi creature is released on the city, and that puts Lois in danger. Superman engages with the sci-fi creature. Fisticuffs alone are not enough. And what ends up resolving the conflict is using both the head and the heart of the characters involved to supply a moral lesson for the audience and make the kids that read it a little bit better people than they were when they started. And that is the events of every good Superman story. And this issue does it on like a speed run, right? It is it perfectly encapsulates what a Superman story is, I think, better than any other single issue I've ever read. And we'll give you, if you want to know what is Superman like, here it is, one in a shot glass, Superman story.
I can see where you're coming from. Yes, it does have all those elements, but for me, what holds it back is the Lucy subplot in there. I think the Lucy stuff feels a bit tortured and a bit going to extremes. Then the whole convenience of him smashing into Bizarro, and Bizarro is conveniently the thing that allows Lucy's vision to be cured. I don't like that kind of convenience in it comes off as very Silver Agey in that aspect. And I can understand that's probably what Byrne was trying to do, but I personally that's just not something that I'm a fan of. For me, I think actually my favorite issue in this well, actually, my favorite issues overall throughout this whole arc, not just the Man of Steel, are the Wolfman issues. Like the Wolfman and Ordway stuff definitely speaks to me a lot more. But as far as the Byrne stuff, I think my favorite is probably the Batman one. I think that does a good job of establishing a new status quo for them. I do think it's a little weird that Superman's all like, "Oh, you're an outlaw." It's like, come on, dude.
Yeah, I was gonna
But
say that's the issue uh, where this Superman being so very very Republican bugs me the most.
Yeah.
Of you're a vigilante that wears dark colors. I only like vigilantes that wear bright colors. Off to
Yeah.
jail. And I do really like the parts of the issue. I love the Batman plan. I love the way John Byrne draws Batman. I don't think he gets enough credit for how good his Batman looks. But I love the gimmick with if you touch me, an innocent person will die, or I planted a bomb, and then it's on him so that Superman can hear that he's not lying. For my taste, Dark Knight over Metropolis, I feel like kind of it's not their first meeting, but in a couple years, the Triangle Era guys get to kind of redo this, and that sets up a Batman Superman status quo I like a lot more. I also think if you're picking a villain to be the first, to be the foe that the world's finest face on their first outing, Magpie is a
Yeah,
wild
yes, that is
choice.
definitely fair. Yeah. Yeah, it's not a perfect issue by any stretch of the imagination. There are definite issues, problems with it. Magpie being a principal among them.
You
Um,
know, you know
but
what? I will shout out though that speaking of I also the Wolfman and Ordway stuff in this trade. Adventures of Superman is my favorite part of this era of Superman,
mhm.
and I think it's where you see the seeds of what really works throughout the rest of the '80s and the '90s. But actually, a moment in this series that I think uber Republican Superman makes for a pretty good story is the Karak stuff, because that sets Superman up to learn an arc, to have an arc where he learns I shouldn't be over here doing this.
Mhm.
And I think at this moment, for no reason of any specific reasoning, having a story where a hero finds out that he should not just go over and start kicking people's ass in the Middle East because he doesn't really understand the situation that he's putting his foot into could be pertinent.
Mhm.
Like there is a time and a place for minding your own business. And though the Sinbad arc that Kurt Swan works on later is a little goofy, that also calls that back. It just creates a really interesting thing where this Superman puts his foot in a problem that hounds him for years after this. And is a very Superman moment. I think it's a moment that anybody with Superman's powers could see themselves stepping on that rake without necessarily making him look like a bad person or anything.
No, I thought the Karaki stuff was very interesting. And I thought Ordway did a good job of threading that needle. But also, remember at this time, Iraq was on our side. So I think that's also, I think that's Wolfman kind of going against the Reagan stuff in there a little bit that Byrne was doing.
Oh yeah, well, and that's why I'm not saying that stuff was pro Reagan. I'm just saying that having Byrne set up that Reagan Superman puts him in the perfect place to mess up in that Karak arc was all I was saying. Is like if you don't have that thing where he's flying around turning down people's radios and trying to take Batman to jail at first, then you don't get to have that really cool arc in the Karak arc. And I think that's really something special. And I think it changes this Superman in a really interesting way that you see carry out into the rest of the 90s.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think that's a good note to end on with the first volume of Man of Steel. So, Logan, why don't you tell people where they can find you?
Again, Single Bound Podcast. Right now, we're only on Spotify, though we are putting our feelers into figuring out how to do YouTube as well. But we have a pretty good back catalog now. If you want to reach us, you can reach us at singleboundpod@gmail.com with comic book suggestions. It is still a ghost town in there. We are excited and thrilled for you to send us suggestions, and we will pull them right off the top of the stack.
Okay, great. All right, so you can check that out in the show notes. We'll have links to that. As for us, superherocinephiles.com is the website, superherocinephiles.com on Blue Sky, Super Cinema Pod on all their places, though Blue Sky is really the best place to get in touch with us. And also, if you want to keep up with my writing, check out pulpcorner.substack.com or go to percivalconstantine.com. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.
Thanks for listening to the Superhero Cinephiles podcast. Superhero Cinephiles is produced by me, Percival Constantine. The show is created by myself and the late, great Derek Ferguson, our host emeritus. Visit us on the web at superherocinephiles.com to listen to past episodes or find out how you can be a guest yourself. Support the show by visiting our advertiser links or click the Buy Me a Coffee link on the website to make a one-time donation. We are Super Cinema Pod on both Instagram and Blue Sky, so please be sure to follow us. We'd also appreciate if you could rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts and share us with your friends.
Thank you for listening. And as always, good night, good evening. God bless.